Hello and welcome to this segment on context of autism. I think you're going to enjoy this course. We're going to need to start off with a little review, a little bit of context as we move forward into interventions for learners with autism spectrum disorder. I want to go back to the history of autism and give you a brief outline of how autism spectrum disorders came to be a part of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is used to as a part of the child find for special education. But in terms of autism spectrum disorder, it started with a child psychiatrist named Leo Kanner. He was working in the United States, and in 1943 he saw a group of children with a common set of characteristics, and he identified them as having autistic disturbance. Now, at the same time, Hans Asperger was a pediatrician in Vienna. In 1944, he identified a clinical group of children with common characteristics, and he called them autistic psychopathies. Well, the word autistic was coined in 1916 by Bleuler. He defined it as completely withdrawing from the social world around them. So that's why these two doctors chose that term for this clinical group of students and children. Between these two doctors, working worlds apart and using different languages, they noted very similar characteristics, which included withdrawal, insistence on sameness, deficits in communication, inability to relate to others, preferring solitude, being more interested in objects than people, changes in routine are upsetting. They had echolalia, but an excellent rote memory. They had literal interpretation of speech and showed impaired use of eye contact, gestures, and facial expressions. Now, Kanner, his syndrome was known as infantile autism, and it wasn't until the 1980s that it was recognized in the DSM. Prior to the 1980s, children with these characteristics were diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia. But in the 1980 DSM-3, autism was recognized. In 1987, the term was changed to autistic disorder. Lorna Wing reviewed Asperger's work and identified Asperger's syndrome. Wing identified differences between Kanner's group of children, which he described as having more overt symptoms, including significant language deficits, and Asperger's students were socially awkward children, where Wing coined the concept of autism spectrum. She saw that although there were a few differences between the descriptions of students between Kanner and Asperger, it did appear to be a spectrum disorder. So, Wing transformed the concept of autism and Asperger's syndrome by getting it in the version of the DSM-4 in 1994. But ultimately, this is a spectrum disorder we're talking about here. In terms of identifying intervention, there's no need to differentiate between autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. Well, so prior to the more recent DSM, we're on the 5th version right now. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Autism was listed under an umbrella term. So this may seem familiar to you because it's been a very popular view over the last 30 years. This umbrella was called pervasive developmental disorders, or autism spectrum disorders. And it included 5 specific disorders. Each of these disorders was similar characteristics. And it was determined that the increase in prevalence was related to the difficulties with diagnosis, even when the range of disorders and how they were identified. Additionally, and more specifically, there were difficulties to differentiate high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. Diagnosticians were leaning toward language ability and intelligence as the differentiation characteristic. But neither of these are actually diagnostic characteristics of either disorder. So it became very difficult to differentiate between high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. So the triad of impairments for autism was pared down to a dyad of impairments: social skills and restricted interests. But they combined the communication and the social skills together because they felt like that was too difficult to differentiate. Now, someone with autism definitely would have delayed language, and someone with Asperger's syndrome might have early development of language. But language wasn't necessarily the only piece of communication that was similar or different between the two. So they put communication with social skills because the pragmatics of language, meaning understanding language in different contexts, seemed to be a difficulty across the spectrum. So they erased that umbrella term for pervasive developmental disability and just made one diagnostic of autism spectrum disorder. It encompasses both autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. So that's in the current version of the DSM. And childhood disintegrative disorder, autistic disorder, and Asperger's disorder are now combined. Pervasive developmental disorder and NOS, which is not otherwise specified, where students who primarily had just one of the three original characteristics as a deficit. And I imagine that that is kind of spread out across specific learning disability or a language impairment, speech and language impairment, or a sensory impairment. So we can talk a little bit about the prevalence, and that is just the current estimate of autism. That is now saying that the prevalence is 1 in 58. Now, it was for a long time 1 in 150, and then it was 1 in 80, and then it was 1 in 68. In the most recent CDC report found an average of 1 in 58 with a range across demographics in the country. But why? Well, we could think about the awareness that's been built, so more people may be aware of the disorder. They may be better identifying, or people may be pushing for the specific category to have a child diagnosed with because they feel like they can get more and better services. But look at all of the media we've seen over the years. People have been very interested in autism spectrum disorder. Now, additionally, it is a neurobiological disorder that certainly has some environmental components. So there could be a lot of reasons why we're seeing this increase in prevalence. But it's hopeful that this new diagnostic with the dyad of symptoms, social communication differences, and repetitive behaviors or obsessive interests will help a more consistent and more accurate diagnosis. So let's take a look at these characteristics and associated characteristics that we find with autism spectrum disorder. Social communication differences are a hallmark of ASD, since communication differences alone and restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior are seen in other disorders. It seems that social codes are indecipherable to individuals with ASD, and they are therefore exhibiting behaviors that seem babyish or maybe even gross by peers. These individuals may be seemingly rude or spoiled to those in the community that do not understand how the autistic mind works. Now, we see less repetitive behaviors with students with level 1 ASD, those with higher cognitive and language development, but more preoccupations, fixations, and special interest areas. You'll see these individuals do have a strong need for sameness, though. What would normally be seen as a treat or a surprise for a neurotypical child could be troubling or stressful to a child with ASD. When faced with unpredictable events, these children feel overwhelmed, may melt down or withdraw. Now, although language allows communication through structured use of words and signs, we also communicate without using language. Remember, communication is the process of sharing information between two or more persons. This can be verbal or through gestures or even body language. Learning to communicate can seem like a hidden curriculum for students with autism spectrum disorder, and they do not always naturally read each other's intentions, context, and nonverbal language. Pragmatics specifically make it difficult for students to understand the meaning of what another person may be saying. A person with autism may interrupt, have social blunders, difficulties with nonverbal language. That all can disrupt daily interactions. So not only do we have those specific characteristics for diagnosis, there are also associated features, one being sensory differences. Abnormalities in processing sensory sensations can cause hypersensitivity or undersensitivity. But certainly this hyper or hyposensitivity will cause students to respond differently to various sensory input because they may be seeking or avoiding activities to access and gain that input. Additionally, there are cognitive features. Students with autism spectrum disorder typically have a sort of uneven cognitive profile that still causes academic difficulties. You may have heard the term savant, which means having a specific area of strength, giftedness, or talent. This occurs in what they're reporting at about 10 to 30% of students with ASD. Some students with ASD have specific learning disabilities in math or reading, even though their overall performance IQ may be very high. But ultimately, we do see students with ASD having specific weaknesses in comprehensions due to those social communication differences. The narrow range of interests limits engagement in class. And you can also note some characteristics that are shared with ADHD. Handwriting and athletic skills are noted difficulties for students with ASD. This is compounded by the sensory and social difficulties when interacting in teams, in the gymnasium, or in outdoors during PE. And difficulties understanding and managing emotions makes school exhausting for these students. There have been notable significant high rates of depression and suicidal tendencies, as well as aggression for students on the autism spectrum. You'll realize there is an increased risk for comorbid or additional medical and psychiatric conditions for individuals with ASD. So it's kind of an interesting, like, common paired with ASD in a more significant numbers than you see with a neurotypical child. First, the theory of executive dysfunction. It indicates poor self-regulation, which leads students with ASD to have difficulty in problem solving, inhibition, and set shifting, which you might see with that perseveration. This all links up with executive function skills deficits. Difficulties making a goal and problem solving and following through to achieve that goal. It's pretty simple, but it's very important for success and independence. There's also the theoretical perspectives of ASD regarding theory of mind. So impaired theory of mind, or what they call TOM, indicates that children with ASD begin with a delay in joint attention as young children. And that's what we call mind blindness. Well, it leads to mind blindness, which is not realizing others' emotions. Students with mind blindness have difficulties understanding those false beliefs. Impaired TOM explains why people with ASD cannot predict others' behaviors. It causes great challenges socially and with comprehension. And finally, we have the theory of weak central coherence. This explains why these individuals have difficulty integrating, solving, as well as comprehension. Integrating information into a meaningful whole. So they see the trees, but not that there's a forest there. Okay, so this is going to sum up the context of autism.